Good evening. Good evening. And so please welcome Dr. Jennifer Seavey.
Well, that's a first for me. Thanks, Dad. All right, so maybe the title is throwing you off, but this is going to actually be about terns. But I thought, well, who cares about terns? So I thought I better put a few slides in here setting it up. Like, who cares about seabirds? So I wanted to kind of set the stage before I got into my work. And this, by the way, is my research. The last time I was here, I was talking about the lab and what we do at the lab. And if anyone wants to talk about that afterwards, I'd be happy to. But what I'm presenting today is my personal research that I do with a whole team of people. So it's not just me out there. We have actually 4 people at any given season helping me with my research. So all that I'm going to show you is a result of all of that. But I did want to first set up what are seabirds and who cares. You got to be motivated, right? So there's a long history of seabirds and people on the water. Who here has heard the saying like albatross around my neck, right? Yeah. And do you know where that comes from? No. No. That Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, A+ over there. It's a poem from the 1700s, and it's all about a sailor who kills an albatross, and that was not the thing to do because they were good luck to sailors. And so then he kills the albatross, and then everything goes wrong. And the whole poem is about everything going wrong and how they're punishing this sailor who killed the albatross. So generally speaking, seabirds are harbingers in the maritime lore of good luck and a good omen. They are generally associated with the land, although that would be more so in the summer or breeding season than the winter. So when you saw them and you were sailing across the ocean, you were probably much relieved when you saw them because you knew you were coming to land. And also, if you're a fisherman or woman, seabirds are where you want to fish. So if you see a whole bunch of seabirds fishing in the water, that's where you want to go. So all of you fishers out there, follow the birds. So while 2/3 of the world is water, only 3% of birds are seabirds, which is really fascinating. It says a lot about how hard it is to be a seabird. And a seabird, by the way, is not a scientific term. It really is a group of birds that make their living in some way on or near the water. So generally speaking, they feed in the ocean. There's about 350 seabirds worldwide. They're more numerous in the ends of the earth than tropical water. Why is that? Anyone know? Why do seabirds like cold water? More fish. So not a greater diversity of fish, just more fish. So more food to eat. There's a greater diversity of seabirds in the southern hemisphere. Anyone want to guess why that is?
Fishing and killing.
Definitely lots of fish, but just think about the picture of the globe. And there's more water. More ocean, right? So just more what we would call niche area for them to live in. So the majority of them feed on the ocean, small fish, things floating on the ocean, zooplankton, crustaceans, squid, you name it, they eat it. They're generally long-lived. In the bird world, that means 20 to 60 years. They delay maturation, which means they leave the colony as a young chick and they don't come back to the colony for a few years before they start breeding. So that on the seabird average is 7 years, and it's somewhere between 3 and 11 for all the species. And that says how, again, it's hard to fish. Like, they don't call it catching, they call it fishing, right? It's just hard to make your living catching fish. So, and there's a lot of skill involved. So to get the skill, amass the skills in order to raise a family, you need to go out there and become a good fishing seabird. And then they have low reproductive output, which makes sense. Again, if it's hard to catch fish, you don't want to have a whole nest full of nestlings that you have to take care of, 1 to 3 chicks per seabird. So they live long to make up for having small clutches. And they typically tend to be monogamous over the course of their life, but there's a whole talk, actually, I could come back and give about gull divorce. Gulls get divorced. We have a long-term study of gulls on Appledore Island, and we have long-term data on who's paired with who and how well they do. They generally get divorced if they start failing on their nests. But sometimes a female can leave their mate because another male has a better territory. That might sound familiar to some of you. I don't know. So the wonderful thing about seabirds, and the reason why I'm probably a seabird biologist, is this. Wow. Colonies. So I joke this is why I'm a seabird biologist, is because that's data. And just a ton of it, and it's easy to get, right? So for scientists, that's like, field day. 95% of seabirds are colonial. So they love to be in these big colonies. Are you enjoying my guessing games? Okay. Why do you think they like to be in colonies? Protection. Number 1 is protection. And if you ever get to visit a seabird colony, sit and watch them because they react in a really wonderful way when they do see a predator. Usually one or two will see the predator and they make a noise or they make some kind of physical movement, and then everyone starts making that physical movement or noise, and then they scatter. Can be a very entertaining thing. What else?
Good selection of possible mates.
Excellent. So you can see who's got the better territory and leave your mate for them. What else? What about being in the middle? This is Canada, by the way. These are northern gannets. And you're in the middle here versus out here on the edge. Warm, yeah, especially in Canadian summer. And then one more thing associated with how hard it is to find fish. So if you're fishing or birding, for people who love birding, what's like the easiest way to find a bird or find a fish? See who else is finding fish, right? So if you see a boat pulling up a lot of fish, you're probably going to go over there. If you see a birder getting excited looking through binoculars, you should probably go over there. So this is an information center. So they follow each other. If somebody keeps coming, I keep saying somebody, but you're with me. These are the birds, right? If a bird comes back with fish and everyone sees it, well, they're going to follow that bird and see where that bird's going. So this is a wonderful thing because so many important things are happening at this colony. They're breeding, they're catching the fish, and as I said, for me, I'll show you lots of data. In fact, I'm going to show you right now. A sad thing about seabirds. This is a worldwide study published in 2015 of all the seabirds that are studied across the globe and the size of the population over time from 1950 to 2010. Seabirds are actually the most endangered group of birds on Earth. And I'm going to tell you why that is in a second. But it's ironic because seabirds are actually an amazing indicator of marine health. And this picture right here kind of sums up why that is. So seabirds, marine mammals, and fish, predatory fish, so those of you who ate the swordfish tonight, they're up here. These are the predators of the ocean, and they eat everything below this, okay? So if everything below this is falling apart, they're going to show it. And if you think about what's the easiest, if you are a scientist and you want to study something that will indicate marine health, of those 3 groups, what do you think's the easiest one to get good data on? I just showed you the colony picture, right? So it is hard to find whales. And I have a few friends who are studying seals and whales, and you chase them around for a long time before you get a piece of data. And it's hard to catch fish. And you chase them around a lot before you get a piece of data. I just walk into a seabird colony, and I've got thousands of data points right there. So they're a really handy way to look at everything below them. So they are used widely in the scientific literature as indicators of marine health. So if there's one good reason to care about seabirds, it is this. And a lot of people use them in this way to sort of monitor the health of the oceans. And this is a study on a Cassin's auklet. This is on the west coast. It's related to a puffin. And this is mortality of Cassin's auklet. So a bar goes up when more of them die. And this is over time. And this is sea surface temperature on the west coast over time. So peaks in water temperature are associated with peaks in mortality of these birds. This is just one example of thousands of studies on seabirds that show associations with changes in the ocean and the sensitivity of the seabirds to those changes. So what is threatening them? We were just talking about wedding dresses and how they seabirds remind you of wedding dresses. In the 1800s, the millinery trade was huge. Women put entire seabirds, and in fact, terns were very popular on their hat. And this is a tern on this woman's hat. And it was so popular that they almost wiped out a lot of seabirds and wading birds. It was just, Audubon actually was a big sort of proponent of ending this trade. And that's when we got the Migratory Bird Act in the early 1900s, sort of as a response to this incredibly wasteful use of seabirds. And then, of course, hunting, which continues to this day. Fisheries impacts are big. Just getting caught in fisheries gear is always a challenge. And then, so this is the number of species, seabird species that have been impacted. And the number one here for a study done by the BirdLife is invasive species. So on islands, most seabirds, their colonies are on islands. And when an invading novel species like a cat, a fox, a raccoon is introduced to an island, to a group of birds that have never had predators before, they don't react to most mammalian predators. And so a raccoon could wipe out an entire seabird colony in as fast as they can eat the eggs. So invasive species have had huge impacts on seabirds over time. And then this is hunting and habitat changes. And then climate change nowadays, and then this is a bird with plastic in its stomach, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about that. And then, of course, unfortunately, climate change is a huge issue. And this is a very famous now graph of information from the Gulf of Maine. And this is 1980 through a few years ago. And the overall trend during that time is this increased dotted black bar. But if you look at where we're going, this rate of change of warming of the Gulf of Maine is ramping up. So the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's ocean. So whenever I say that, most people's next thing out of their mouth is, why? Right? Okay, this is why. Basically, the Gulf of Maine is a big bathtub. The water just swirls around. And the cold water comes from the north. And that is, this current is kick-started by glacial ice melting. And that cold water is pushed down here and into the Gulf of Maine where it swirls around. And then the Gulf Stream, which is over there in red, it comes in, but in the past, the Gulf Stream has actually shot offshore much further south than Cape Cod. But climate change has actually pushed the Gulf Stream further north. And so more warm water eddies are coming in near Georgia's bank. So more warm water is coming in, less cold water is going in. And it gets trapped in this little bathtub circle, and that is why, in a nutshell, I'm kind of boiling it down, but why the Gulf of Maine is changing so rapidly. And I was just at a conference with a bunch of oceanographers, and they've just looked at this in many different ways, and with much, new technology, more recent data, and it's only getting worse. So the Gulf of Maine is a real hot spot. And this is from a really great article from 2015 in the Portland Press Herald about summarizing all the research that had been done showing environmental impacts because of this warming water. And I can tell you too that will hit you close to home. Over time, lobsters are moving offshore and north. And then cod, of course, have already really migrated north. So those two species, which are iconic species of New England, who knows what that is? Any Massachusetts people here?
It's in the State House.
It's in the State House, and it's called the sacred cod. And I mean, that says a lot, and probably many of you know, New England was really founded because of that fish. And it's just ironic that now they're moving out because they are a cold water bottom fish. And so cold water fish are moving to the north. And warm water fish are actually coming in, and we can see that in our tern research. This does have an effect, of course, on fisheries, and I'm going to make a very quick connection here between fisheries and the terns, so stay with me here. So fisheries are in decline. This is New Hampshire. Actually, this right here is Gulf of Maine wide data. I'm going to show you some New Hampshire data. But this is fisheries in decline over time in the Gulf of Maine. And in New Hampshire, it's really tanked out. There's very few fishing families still in the state of New Hampshire. And most of that's around groundfish. And groundfish have a complicated history around fishing and maybe overfishing, but also climate change is now impacting those bottom fish that like cold water. And of course, most of you know that lobster is very, very important in the Gulf of Maine. It is the biggest money maker. This is a pie graph from last year. That blue pie, the biggest piece, is the value of lobster compared to other fisheries in the Gulf of Maine. And this is the total number of landings, like the amount taken out. Again, lobster is the biggest piece. What I want to bring your attention to is the next biggest piece, and that is herring. And herring are used for bait for the lobster. So that's why it's number 2, because it's catching number 1. So herring are very important to the lobster industry. And here, this is the value of herring in blue, going up over time. This starts in the 60s through today. And this is the catch. The catch is highly variable, very difficult to predict. And in the last year, there's been a lot of restriction on the herring fishery. And that puts a lot of stress on the lobster industry. But here's where I'm connecting it to the seabirds. The number 1 most important food to seabirds in the Gulf of Maine is herring. Why are they so important? Because they're very fatty. If you've ever eaten herring, they're really greasy. And that is great food for seabirds. And so we have data from our colony actually, and this data repeats in puffin colonies and cormorant colonies, that herring, when there's a lot of herring in the diet, they do well reproductively, and chicks grow well with herring, so it's very important. And I will say that I'm not suggesting there's a conflict here, because actually the birds eat about 10% of the herring population, so it's a very small percentage compared to what the lobster industry. There's not a conflict, but as the herring industry is impacted by the lobster industry, that's where it might impact the seabirds, okay? So in the Gulf of Maine, there are different species of terns, puffins, guillemots, gulls, cormorants, petrels that all breed in the Gulf of Maine over the course of the summer from April to August. And those red dots are colonies for all of these birds. And there's a person on every single colony, every major colony in the Gulf of Maine, which is amazing. And we actually have a working group called the Gulf of Maine Seabird Working Group, and we meet before this season. So we meet in March, and then we meet in September, and we talk about all of this. It's the most collaborative work I've ever been involved in, We all have each other's phone numbers, and when something's happening at one colony, we talk about it. So it's we all share data. In fact, here's the data from everybody. We are very collaborative, which is not always the case in science. So this is where really good science happens, when you're all adding your data together and actually also doing your research using the same methods. So it's very comparable. So as you can see, these are the different species. You might not be able to read it, but these are the different species that are being studied in the Gulf of Maine. And one thing that should pop out at you right away is there's lots of zeros, except for you get to this column, and that's common terns. And that's what I study. And one of the reasons why I study them is because they're everywhere in the Gulf of Maine. And I know the Gulf of Maine is changing rapidly because of the water temperature. I know they're eating a very important species, herring, and we have access to all this data. So that means that this particular species of seabird, to me, is a great indicator for all those reasons for what's happening in the Gulf of Maine. So taking you to where my research project is, we leave Portsmouth on a boat and go 10 miles out to the Isles of Shoals. The Isles of Shoals are half in Maine, half in New Hampshire. Here it is blown up again. The Marine Lab I told you about last time, that's here on Appledore Island. And then down here at White and Seavey Island is where the tern colony is. And yes, that again, there's like a lot of nepotism happening here tonight, because that's also named after our family. My 10th great grandfather is William Seavey, came over here from England, and anyway, he lived on Appledore and he fished for cod, and he dried the cod on Seavey's Island. On the old charts it says Seavey's Island. Anyway, so it kind of feels like I've taken back the fatherland by doing my research out here. So here it is. This is White Island with the lighthouse. And then there's the giant island of Seavey Island. It's only actually 5 acres. And so is White Island. So 10 acres total. And we have 3 species of terns. Common terns, the one I was just telling you about, that's everywhere. They're state listed in New Hampshire. By the way, Seavey Island is on the New Hampshire side. Okay, they're state listed in New Hampshire. The roseate tern is a federally listed species. It's of great conservation concern. They're declining, so that they also nest on the island. And then Arctic terns. And this is the furthest south that this bird breeds. It basically breeds all north of here, but we have the last 3 pairs, that 3 or 4, depending on the year, that nest this far south. So common terns. You can see they, all of these terns actually, well, I should say, the common terns and the roseate terns winter in South America, so they're down there right now, I know, enjoying some warmth. But look at the differences in the chicks when I show you. This is the common tern. And by the way, they're really hard to tell apart, so don't, like, this is advanced spurting, but you can look at their beak and their chicks for some obvious differences. This is the roseate tern. Much blacker and no spotting. This Arctic tern is an amazing creature. It's 4 ounces of bird. And over the course of the lifetime of one of these birds, it will fly the equivalency of flying to the moon and back 3 times. 4 ounces of bird. Because they breed in the Arctic and they winter in the Antarctic. They just cold water, and they fly between the two, not in a straight line. They follow wind and kind of take a trip on their way down. So most of our work is focused on the common and the roseate because we have just, a couple of Arctic. So here is the colony data that we have for the common tern and the roseate and the Arctic. There's so many more common terns. It's just much higher. I'll show you a blown up graph in a second. But what do you notice about this graph right away that should make you go, huh?
Yeah.
What?
What happens?
Yeah, it's going up. That's good. But
This was,
what about this? What happened before that?
nobody took any data.
Well, that is a good first guess. Very good first guess. Instead, the answer is there were no birds there. So the terns were on this island historically, but then remember the ladies' hats and the hunting came in and just wiped these birds off this island. And then gulls came in. And gulls are a big predator of tern chicks and eggs. And so Audubon and the state of New Hampshire joined forces in '96, and they did some restoration. So the first thing they had to do was get rid of the gulls. So I'll tell you about that in a second. So, well, I'll tell you that now. The gulls they get rid of, in fact, we continue this method today, very proud of the fact that we don't just go out there and just shoot gulls. We don't kill them. We actually, I was telling some people that I have my dog here at my dad's house right now. My dog has actually worked on this project to do this very thing. We let the dog loose in March, and she runs around the island, and all the gulls are scared and run away from the dog. And then as soon as we see the first tern, we pull the dog off the island. And then the researchers physically just shoo away any gull that tries to come in. We also have these things called screamers. They're like a firecracker, but there's just sound. It's more like a bottle rocket, I guess. And we'll shoot the bottle rocket thing at the gull. We don't hit it. We're just screaming past it to scare it. So we don't use lethal means, but we scare all the gulls away. And we have to keep doing that because over a quarter mile away on Appledore Island is a huge gull colony, which is awesome because we have 25 years in an ongoing study of the gulls, and now we have an ongoing study of the terns. And it's really great to have that data simultaneously so we know what's happening with both the prey and the predator. So in order to get a seabird colony to revitalize itself, you basically have to fake them out with other seabirds. So these are decoys. They painted dozens and dozens of the decoys, put them out on a nest, and they played the call. And this is actually methodology developed by Steve Kress. Has anyone heard of Project Puffin? He's a fellow Cornell faculty member, and he started in the 70s restoring puffins in Maine, and he used this method. And he worked out all the methods, and so now this is how you restore a seabird colony now. It's very effective. The very first year, they had 6 pairs. That is a pretty amazing return rate. And now I'm going to show you a video of what it's like when you're out there now. So this is a tern blind where we sit in it. The birds don't see us and we can see them. And right here is what we call a productivity pen. And there's nests in there. And the reason why we fence it in is because when the chicks hatch, they start running around. And if you're trying to track one nest and the chicks start running around and mixing with all the other nests, you don't know who's left anymore. So we actually pen them in so we can gather them all up and basically do a head count every few days. So watch this video. I'm going to put the microphone here on the... Could you hear that all right? So I don't know if you noticed they were coming at me in the phone I was holding up to record that. So they're very aggressive around getting rid of potential predators. And we wear hats that we stuff, like a baseball hat that we stuff full of socks. Because they are really delicate and they're federally listed, so you don't want to hurt them, like by wearing a bike helmet or something like that. So you give them a nice, easy crash landing on your head. And because you've got that cushioning, you're fine too. But they do poop all over you. But I'll tell you about what we're doing with that in a second, because it's kind of cool. So 4 years ago, when well, not right when I got, but when I got to the lab, I was looking for, I've been at the lab for 5 years now, and I was looking around for what I'm going to do for my own research. And I'm a seabird biologist, and there was this amazing long-term gull project, but that already had a scientist and 25 years of work. So I looked over to this other island, and there was a consulting firm been hired by the state of New Hampshire to just monitor the tern colony. And I thought, well, that's cool, they're doing that, but they're missing all this opportunity for research. So we threw our hat into the ring and applied to be the consulting firm. And we told them, if you hired us, we're going to do a ton of research on top of what you want the consulting firm to do. So we actually won the bid. And so we've been funded by the state of New Hampshire. It's off of the license plate fund. And that covers endangered species and species of concern. So thank you, anyone who's driving around with that license plate. So they ask us for that contract, we have to protect the birds, so keep the gulls away and any other predator. We have to monitor all of the birds and see what they're doing reproductively. Numbers, how many are there, and what they're doing for their breeding. So that's where these little playpens come in the bird blinds. So we're studying what they're eating, how well they're doing. We banned all of the chicks and adults. So this is a fish and wildlife ban. It is any bird that's banded in the United States gets one of these silver bracelets, and it has a unique number on it, and it goes into a federal database. And if you found this bird in Argentina or somewhere, you would know where it came from. And then this band is what we call the field readable band. It's turned away from us, but it actually has a letter combination that's unique to this bird. And then the color is unique to the species and the location. So if anyone else sees this bird, they can actually go into another federal database. These are also recorded by the same federal folks. We have to apply to get these permits, and we're all well trained to do this work. Not anyone can just throw a band on a bird. So all of this is in our federal database, but it helps us, basically this is the name of this bird, and it helps us track individual birds over time. Do they come back every year? Do they have the same number of offspring? Do they do well or poorly every year? So there's a lot of trends that we're interested in tracking on an individual level. And then this picture is what the state of New Hampshire does for habitat management. So one thing that seabirds worldwide, and certainly in the United States, have to deal with is that we love the ocean. We love the coast, right? We all want to build vacation houses or permanently live there. And so we have reduced the number of islands that are available for seabirds. Does that make sense? So we have to manage the habitat more than we would naturally. Naturally, if the vegetation grew up, the birds would go to another island. But there aren't other islands because everybody lives on all the other islands. So the state of New Hampshire burns the vegetation that grows up very densely so that we can keep the vegetation down. And this is actually one of the studies we're looking at, is how do we more effectively manage this vegetation. So an interesting thing about tern and seabird research is that gulls are the bad guys. And this is a paper that basically this is data, number of herring gulls, blackback gulls, laughing gulls that were killed on this puffin colony, and how the paper basically, the summary is, killing gulls is a good thing if you want more puffins. And so it's widely gull termination, if you will, or gull control programs are really widely accepted in the Gulf of Maine and many other places to protect seabirds. But we have data from the island next door about the gulls. And here are the herring gulls and the squares and the blackbacks and the triangles. And this is 1970 to now. Herring gulls are in decline. Blackback gulls are not doing great either. So why are we killing a species that's actually in decline to help another species that's already in decline? Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And because we have people studying the gulls, we've actually identified, and this now is being seen at other colonies and being appreciated more widely, but there are only problematic gulls. Not all gulls are bad. Actually, gulls specialize in what they eat. So there's probably some like pizza fans or something in this crowd, right? And you just wish you could eat that every day. Well, a gull will eat that every day. They find the thing they like, and that's the only thing they eat. And so we've actually found the problematic gulls on the island. We lovingly call them the terminator. It's actually hard to say. So we have found gulls that at their nest site have like hundreds of tern remains. So if you want to be smart and strategic and not make a big hit on the gull population, you will figure out those problematic gulls and you just remove those gulls, because all of the other gulls are eating other things. So we've come up with another strategy for how you deal with the gull problem. And we actually just take those gulls for a long ride. We don't kill them, we just take them somewhere else. It's like their vacation. Yeah, well, hopefully it is. So as I was saying, we do productivity monitoring. There's a little baby roseate tern. And every year, every single tern colony does a census in the same week, where we make a big line. It's actually just 3 of like 12 people who are out this day. We all line up and we walk across the island like this and we count every single nest. And they do that at every other colony in the Northeast in the same week, which is an amazing effort so that we know the status of all these birds. So here again is the story from this colony, and now you know why it starts on 97. I took the common tern data out. Now you can see the details of the 2 lower bars. This is the roseate tern here and the Arctic tern. Now I'm not worried about why that number is so low, because this is the low, we only have a few of them. This is more interesting, how much it goes around. It's good that it's been going up. This, we think, was an event at another colony where a whole bunch of birds came to our colony. So this is the reason when you study terns that you need to know all of your other tern buddies at the other islands, because terns will move around. So you have to, we just lost 100 terns. We have them up here, yeah. So you have to talk to each other to make sure you can account for all of these birds. So this is what we're doing for the research. We're looking at habitat quality, what they eat, and pollution problems. So the habitat quality, as I said, they can't move to other islands because this is private, the lab, private. There's other islands that they could possibly go to. This one has some private houses on it. This one has tons of gulls on it. So they're kind of stuck here. So we have to make sure we're managing their habitat well. So we looked in the data for how other people are doing it. And we found this study from 2015 looking at all the different seabird colonies and all the different ways that they manage habitat and how effective it was. So the higher the bar, the more effective. And this is the burning. This is what the state is doing now. So it's middle of the road. So we wanted to try some other ways of managing the habitat, just test it out experimentally so we can see if something works better. So we tried this one, weed barriers, and right here, salt. I know this looks like it's way down here on the low end, but we were talking to a botanist, showing them all the suite of possibilities. And we, wanted to pick something that would be inexpensive, because remember, this is the state of New Hampshire. Plus, wildlife, there's not tons of money out there. We wanted to do something that would be relatively easy to do because we knew we didn't want to get into something that was going to be high maintenance. And we wanted to try to find something that would be environmentally friendly, and I'll show you we've had some mixed success in that. But when we were talking to our botanist friend, he said, the way that they normally use salt to kill vegetation is just to pour salt water. He's like, you need way more salt than that. So we went out and tried this last year. We used the fire that the state was already doing, And then we built plots around the size of a bucket, and we just put salt on it, not salt water. We put a really high concentration of salt that we knew would be more effective in killing the vegetation, but not be a big environmental impact because you're surrounded by the ocean. The salt would just run off into the ocean. And then we also used a weed barrier, and we went around and around about what to use. And this is why I said it gets a little bit messy with the environmental stuff, because we ended up using AstroTurf. And we picked that because it's green, like the vegetation. It would be the same temperature. If we used any black plastic or weed barrier, which is what most landscapers use, that would be very hot. And we didn't want to cause another problem. And AstroTurf is designed to drain well. So it had a lot of attributes that we loved, but we don't love the fact that it's made out of plastic. We actually scrubbed them really well to try to make sure that any loose plastic was off of them, and then we nailed them down really hard, and we removed them at the end. And if this turns out to be effective, we're actually going to go looking for another better way to, build a barrier like this. So this is actually data that we are looking at right now. And I will tell you that both the salt and the barrier worked. I don't know which one was more effective right now. So I think we're going to end up using one of those. And I frankly, the salt would be easier and environmentally friendlier. All right, what you eat. So every other day when we're in those bird blinds, those square boxes, the interns and researchers who are helping us look down with the binoculars or a spotting scope, watch a nest and see what the parents are bringing back to the chicks. Now the great thing is the birds bring back the fish outside of their mouth. So you have, maybe a minute to identify the fish, which you actually get pretty good at. And you can tell the size relative to the beak. So we know what the beak size is. So we have a whole data sheet about like beak size relativity and what species it is and how often they bring it back. And so we're collecting data in this method. And Audubon actually started doing this. And then a graduate student from the University of New Hampshire grabbed some of that data from the island. So this is a 2000 to 2014 data. And this is productivity of the birds, how many chicks they had. And this is the herring and hake percentage in the diet for the same years. And so when herring are low, productivity is low. And that's another point of reference for why herring are so important. We see things like this all the time. But we know that identifying these fish can be hard. You have maybe a minute to identify that. So we found a colleague who does DNA analysis of poop. And then we started looking at the poop covering us as a whole new this is now data. And so look, this is the biologist. She's a postdoc at University of New Hampshire, Gemma Klukas, and she has a plastic hat so she can get a nice clean sample when the birds poop on her. And this is Liz Craig. She's my research partner of many years, and this is them. Actually, the nice thing, and you can imagine that when a bird actually gets handled by a person, they get scared, and that's when we get a sample. So not only is the sample raining down on us, but we are getting it from the bird. And it's actually better when we have the bird in the hand because we can see the band number. We know exactly who that came from, okay? And we've been collecting data on all the species and the adults and the chicks, and this has been really interesting. And this is so hot off the press. It's not been published or anything. It's like smoking right now. This is all the different species that we've seen these terns eating here. And this is what we see when we're in the blind, if it has a gray bar. And on this side is the DNA data. So it's cool because they don't totally match, and then in some areas they do match. So it says a number of things. One, as I suspected, we're not that great at identifying all the species, especially some of the smaller species are hard to see when they're being brought back, or the adults are eating different things than the chicks. And we know that herring and hake, right here, are really important to the chicks. So I highly suspect, and this is just 1 year of data, and we have 3 years, and she's in the lab right now doing this work. I suspect that the adults are not eating as many herring as the chicks are. That when the adult catches a herring, if it has a chick, it would bring that herring back to the chick because it's more valuable to the chick than the adult. And the adults are eating a wider variety of things. One species on here that is very concerning that was showed up on both is butterfish. Butterfish is a warm water southern species that's been coming into the Gulf of Maine, and it is a big problem for seabirds, all seabirds, because seabird babies can't eat them. From the top, they look like a long, skinny fish like a herring or hake or a sand lance, but when you pick it up, it's actually fat. So it's narrow, but it's just like my hand. It's narrow on the top, but fat widthwise, and the babies can't even get it down their mouth. And puffin babies actually choke and die. Tern babies just don't eat it. They just discard it. And all over the colony the last 2 years, and this year was worse, are butterfish everywhere. And so that did not happen the first 2 years. So that is a growing problem that's very concerning, because every time that chick does not eat that butterfish, it's starving. And this year we actually had a bad year because chicks were starving. This is the frequency of those fish just from the DNA data. And I was happy to see that already our assumptions about herring and hake is almost as valuable as herring, but those two species are the most common in the diet, and that just makes a lot of sense to us. So I had an intern this summer who was looking at plastics across seabirds on the island, both the gulls and the terns. And we looked at this from opportunistically. If we found a bird that had died, we didn't kill any birds to look at this, but if we found a bird that had died, we did a necropsy. We also looked at pellets. So like an owl, a lot of seabirds, if there's parts that they can't digest, they throw it up. They call it casting. I think it just makes it more palatable. And this is the pellet from that. When gulls feed their babies, they regurgitate. So we looked at that. And remember, when the terns feed their babies, they give them a whole fish. So we looked at fish. And these are the types of plastics that we found. These are the pictures from the birds, what we found in the birds. And these are sort of the examples of where that plastic came from. And by the way, we only looked at plastic bigger than 1 millimeter. We did not look at microplastics. You probably all heard a lot about microplastics in the news. These are more medium plastics, if you will, 1 millimeter and bigger. So these are the different sample types, the adult birds that we found, chicks that we found. If they died, we then did an autopsy. These are the fish that we found, the terns feeding their chicks. Remember the pellets that the birds cast, and the regurgitant that the gulls are feeding their babies. And if it's yellow, it means we found plastic in those sources. So the great news is chicks they don't have plastic. And remember, 1 millimeter and up. I'm not saying anything about microplastics. They could be there. But we were happy to see that, and I'm actually really happy to see this. And the pellets, that the plastic is not actually being consumed by the adult bird either, although we know that there is some. But they're certainly getting rid of a lot of it before it gets digested. And it is in the regurgitant that the chicks could eat this, but then we didn't see it in the chicks, so maybe they're not eating that. This is looking at all the terns grouped together, herring gulls and blackbacks. Again, the yellow is the frequency, and the herring gulls had the most plastic. This does not surprise me because great blackback gulls are more pelagic, more ocean-oriented in what they eat, and herring gulls are way more omnivorous. That's the bird you're going to encounter on the beach when you're having your picnic. And that's the bird that's going to dumpster dive and all of that. You won't see a blackback doing that, very rarely. So, and what was the most common thing that they're eating? Well, they might have been eating French fries, but the French fries apparently came in sheets of plastic. So this is generally plastic bags and a lot of what look like sandwich bags. So plastic bags like the kind you get at the grocery store or the convenience stores, and then fragments of plastic, all again this like sheet-like plastic. We found foam, lines, you know what nurdles are? It is the actual like the primary form of plastic. When you're going to make anything out of plastic, the way they store plastic is a tiny little pellet. And it's called a nurdle. And they break free all the time in shipping containers. And there's just so many of them in the ocean. And so we did find a few of those, but not much. Mostly it was plastic bags. So where are we going in the future? We are looking more at where they're getting their food. So we actually are going to team up with a fisheries biologist who looks at fish through bioacoustics. So they basically listen for fish. And we're putting tags on the terns. So we're putting GPS tags on the terns. And we're going to do a lot of things. But one of the things we're going to do is basically chase the birds around to where they're feeding. And we're going to then lower bioacoustic equipment and listen for their prey fish. Because we're curious about how these bait fish, the herring, the hake, how they move around and how they move around in time and space. And this is some data that was the graduate student from the University of New Hampshire put GPS tags on them, on the terns, like 5 years ago. And she put it on 5 birds. So the different colors are a different bird. And this is some preliminary data from her work. And so they're going out to sea, but a lot of them like the river mouths, which makes a lot of sense. River mouths like the Piscataqua and the Merrimack is where a lot of bait fish hang out. They love the change from the freshwater to saltwater. It's a great place to fish because those two systems are coming together. But you can see there's some scattering around the island, those, and then this offshore site. But this was one bird, so we want a lot more data on this. And we're going to chase them as well and look at what are the bait fish in the area, how many are there, how do those change over time, and how consistent is this? She only had the opportunity to do this for 2 weeks, and we're putting tags on them that'll last for 2 years. So we'll have a lot more data to add to this story. So that's one direction we're going starting next summer. And we're also actually in the process of writing a grant for continuing this plastic work. But this time, we just love the poop thing so much that we are trying to find a scientist to actually analyze the poop for plastic presence in it. Instead of doing all that work of necropsying, all of those birds that were dead anyway, I'd like to look at the birds that are alive. And I'd like to know how many of them have plastic in them. Plastic that we can't see, but we can see a chemical signature of. And since we're already collecting poop anyway, it's a great opportunity. So we're working on a grant for that. So I just wanted to end with 2 more slides. So one, what you can do. Plastic bags is low-hanging fruit here because we just saw that so commonly. So reducing your use of that would be so valuable. People who fish, your fishing gear, we find it in the birds. So keeping all that fishing gear on your boat and well contained is important. We appreciate all the New Hampshire moose plates. And feeding the gulls. That is not a good thing. I actually watched a gull this summer regurgitate to its chick an entire gut full of Cheetos. That is not a good meal for a young gull. And as I showed you, those gulls are in decline. We do not want them eating Cheetos. I almost fell over when I saw this bright orange coming out of this bird, and I'm like, I have to go look at that. Cheetos. If you like this topic, we actually do an adult program at the end of August on the island where me and Liz, my colleague, talk a lot about seabirds. So if you want to come out and see them and learn more about them, you are welcome. And you can find that on our website. And I brought cards back there if you want the website.